Welcome to Science in Your Shopping Cart, a new series that shows how science touches many of the products you buy at the grocery store, from new varieties of fruits and vegetables to technological advances that make your food safer, cheaper, and tastier. I'm Todd Silver. Unless you've been living under a rock, you already know that honeybees and their pollinating cousins are essential to human life. Without honeybees, we cannot grow a lot of the food we love. Honeybees have been around for millions of years, but they face many challenges in today's environment, and their populations ebb and flow. There's predators like the northern giant hornet, there's changing climate conditions, there's insecticides, there's mites carrying diseases, there's food deserts. The number of risks to honeybees is long and growing. What we've learned over decades of bee research is that honeybees and other pollinators are survivors. They're adapters, and they have a powerful ally in humans, mainly because we rely on one another to live and prosper on this planet. Keeping bees healthy and happy, yes, happy because, as you'll learn in this podcast, bees can get really stressed. It's paramount to us all. In fact, bees are so important to agriculture that ARS is conducting pollinator research all over the country. So how do honeybees fit into this podcast, Science in Your Shopping Cart? Well, if it wasn't for honeybees and their pollinator friends, there'd be a lot less food to put in your shopping cart. Oh, and of course there's honey, which you can put in your shopping cart. So there you go. There's a lively discussion in the science community over the state of honeybee populations. Are honeybees dying at an alarming rate? How are they handling climate change? What are their biggest threats? How resilient can they be? I wanted to get an expert's take on this, so I traveled to Beltsville, Maryland, and had to sit down with Dr. Jay Evans. He's a research entomologist at the ARS Bee Research Lab. Evans is also one of the world's leading honeybee experts.
The total number of honeybee colonies has remained fairly even over the last couple decades. But we hear from beekeepers and we see ourselves that those colonies are only there because of a lot of extra work by the beekeepers. They have to replace colonies every year, maybe multiple times a year, because of losses from disease and other factors, including stress. The main thing we hear from beekeepers is over the winter they might lose 30 to 40% of their colonies and sometimes higher. So even though they're rebuilding with much effort each year, we hear from many of them, and these are beekeepers who have kept bees for decades, that they can't keep their colonies healthy and alive consistently.
This sounds like colony collapse disorder, or CCD. This was a huge phenomenon that occurred in the early 2000s. Where beekeepers reported losing up to 90% of their hives. A specific cause of CCD was never identified, but researchers determined that varroa mites, a virus-transmitting parasite, was frequently found in hives hit by CCD.
We're working on the premise that disease is really a big part of this. So varroa mite are a huge factor. They're harder to control now than they used to be. They're resistant to some of the available treatments. And then for whatever reason, their interaction with viruses has become more deadly for honeybees.
But varroa mites aren't the only factors contributing to colony losses. Evans pointed to the 4 Ps: poor nutrition, pesticides, pathogens, and parasites.
Our lab is really focused on the management side. So can we reduce the disease impact? Can we help honeybees avoid disease or avoid other stress, nutrition, pesticides, and disease, and really help any type of bee survive these challenges? It's equally important, of course, to just breed and produce bees that are more resilient to the many challenges they face. But our focus is getting management tools, maybe treatments that will help beekeepers in the face of what we know are pretty important stresses.
Unlike CCD, which was pretty widespread and all of a sudden, the colony reductions occurring today are more scattered, even unpredictable, and they can occur more routinely, even among multi-generational beekeepers.
That's one of the intriguing parts of all this, is that not every beekeeper suffers these losses, and many of them are doing the exact same management routines. One might lose 70% of their bees while the other sails through just fine. That feels like waves of an epidemic, maybe a virus, maybe a disease that comes through and really damages certain apiaries or certain populations of bees and then misses the other ones for some reason. On the positive side, that might mean that some bees are resistant to that disease and there'll be survivors. But unfortunately, we also often see that beekeepers who had a good year one year will suffer the next year. So it's almost like the disease is catching up with them at some point and they suffer the same losses.
There are so many mysteries surrounding honeybees. I mean, they've survived for millions of years, long before humans existed on this planet. Why now, in this era, where honeybees have a strong ally in beekeepers, are these pollinators facing so many challenges?
I think the disease loads are much higher than they've been in decades past. That doesn't mean the viruses are worse these days. It could be another stress or the way that we're managing bees. There is a movement to try to simplify bee management, again, to move them to healthy forage more often. There's even discussions of different hive boxes that might make it a little more comfortable for the bees in regulating their temperature and things like that. Could be that we can reduce some of the stress on them and they will use their own defenses at that point to do better.
Evans points to nutrition as one of the biggest factors in keeping bees healthy. Beekeepers are moving their honeybees all over the country these days to help pollinate crops from apples on the East Coast to almonds on the West. The long distances can be taxing on the queen and her hive, and there may not be enough nutritious food during their travels to keep them strong and healthy.
Moving bees across country certainly can be stressful. Our colleagues who are doing bee breeding have data suggesting that certain breeds do better in certain climates. So if you are focusing on one type of bee by preference or because it survived better in the past, that might lead to staying in the same areas where that bee is most adapted. And that's a really neat trend. And in the U.S., we have so many climates that there could be a bee strain in the Northeast that does great for long winters and another one in Arizona that survives long droughts and a lot of heat.
Indeed, honeybees have adapted to new climates, but our changing climate conditions have reduced food availability in certain areas, such as regions stricken by drought.
And it does seem inevitable that the climate is changing to the extent that crops and bees will be affected. Honeybees, of all the pollinators, are the most resilient. They now live in the tropics and in the Arctic, so they're very good at dealing with different seasons and length of season. But the foods that they'll find and the economic foods that are available to them will certainly change. On the more weather side of things, so droughts are certainly affecting the bee losses just because the bees can't build up their populations late in the summer to get through winter.
Overwintering has become a popular practice among beekeepers. As you'll hear in an upcoming episode, beekeepers are sheltering their bees longer over the winter, giving them more time to rest ahead of the busy spring and summer pollinating periods. That's especially important when caring for the queen, who can lay over 3,000 babies a day when healthy.
Every time you produce a bee, it takes a lot of resources, and if that bee isn't going to return those resources by foraging, it's a loss to the colony, and that means a failure to build the colony up during the summer and to be large enough and to have healthy workers going into winter. So what we see in some of our colonies is they have okay numbers in October, a little bit lower than we want in November, and then by the time the forage starts in March, there aren't any bees left in many of those colonies, so we actually lose them because they just don't quite make it a typical winter anymore.
With fewer worker bees bringing food back to the hive and protecting the hive, the queen and her babies can get stressed, much like we get stressed. In fact, later in this season of Science in Your Shopping Cart on Bees, you'll hear about one researcher who's studying the negative behaviors of bees that are hangry.
Stress is the same in any organism. It can cause them to age a little faster. A lot of the bee diseases don't cause bees to die instantly, but they take 2 or 3 days off the end of their lives. And then that means that the foragers, which are the oldest bees in the colony, are dying with many fewer trips out of the hive. So the food coming in is reduced.
I asked Evans if there are things honeybees can do themselves to avoid stress.
It's interesting. We're looking a bit at plants. Pollen and nectar do have chemicals in them that stimulate immunity in some cases, and maybe they decrease the stress in the bees. So we're really interested in seeing if there are ways when the bees are foraging on flowers that they can collect foods that help them deal with stress and disease that way. Other than that, a lot of it comes back to nutrition. If the bees are able to provide good nutrition to the young developing bees and then also the foragers, they will deal with many stresses. Honeybees are, for insects, incredibly resilient. They've been around so long and they're able to adapt to us as farmers because most insects wouldn't be able to do what honeybees do.
This is true. Honeybees have been around for a long time, but they've never faced the confluence of threats that are present today, with even bigger challenges in the future. In our next episode, we'll look at how researchers are monitoring the long-term health and survival of honeybees. We're here in Albany, California, just a short drive from San Francisco. We're out in the fields today, examining a set of bee boxes. More specifically, we're searching for the queens to see if they and their hives are healthy and happy. Here at ARS's Invasive Species and Pollinator Health Unit, researchers are looking at long-term factors affecting bee health and colony survival. They want to better understand how factors such as nutrition, pesticides, extreme weather, and natural events impact colony performance and sustainability over multiple seasons.
We look at honeybee health starting from about 1947 when there were about 6 million colonies. There has been a significant drop in the colony populations across the US, and we are trying to understand the causes of this colony loss and also see how we can help improve the colony success so that we can meet the pollination needs of growers.
That's Dr. Arathi Sasadri, who at the time of this recording was the research entomologist at the Pollinator Health Unit here in Davis. Sasadri has since become the research leader in the Pollinator Health and Southern Crops Ecosystem Research Unit in Stoneville, Mississippi. We're back at the lab in Davis, looking at data she's been collecting on her honeybees. Sasadri led the establishment of California's long-term honeybee research monitoring network. It should be no surprise that one of her primary focuses while in California was how bees were responding to climate change.
When you see a lot of rapid changes or extreme weather conditions, the demand on these bees is really, really high because they are now taking resources away from finding food and feeding larvae and raising the brood to cooling the hive or warming the hive and kind of maintaining the hive at that correct temperature. For example, if you don't have foragers going out and bringing back food into the hive, the larvae are going to starve, and then the next generation of worker brood is not going to be produced, and that is going to lead to the colony declining gradually. So a very small deviation from the normal can actually impact the colony very, very heavily.
Colony collapse, or steep reductions in bee colonies, typically doesn't happen overnight. A big part of the monitoring network is closely observing beehives often to capture any points of irregularity in performance.
Monitoring them regularly, keeping track of whether you have the given number of bees in the colony actually helps us understand whether the colony is doing well or has it started declining. And the earlier you catch the decline, the better is the chance that you will be able to recover the colony and help it get back on a good trajectory.
Sasadri continues to work closely with beekeepers and farmers to share monitoring data that they've collected. She's also developing guidelines and management practices for not only observing bees, but helping them stay healthy. For example, her team is studying whether beekeepers can determine the health of a hive simply by tracking the approximate number of bees.
One of the measures is called frames of bees. How many actual frames of live bees are there in the colony? That's a good measure of colony strength. What we hope our research will show is what is a good number for frame of bees so that we can tell the beekeepers, hey, when you're monitoring your hives, this is where your range should be. And if it goes below the range, then you're looking at the hive declining and maybe you got to feed them, you got to take care of them, see whether there are diseases. So the goal is to kind of come up with these management guidelines for beekeepers to look at and follow.
Getting back to climate change, researchers are already seeing how hotter days and increased drought conditions are putting additional stress on honeybees, with some migrating elsewhere in search of food, water, and shelter. What Seshadri wants to know is, how will this affect them long term?
One of the big points of this long-term network is incorporating the climate data and looking at how climate is changing. We have very little time to even respond to what might be happening because things are happening right now. One of the big things that's going to come out of this are predictive models as when temperatures go way higher than what we thought it would go and how do colonies respond. So right now, being so warm in California, we are going to get some really good data on how the hives perform.
Another factor being monitored is wildfires. The past few years, California has endured some of the most severe and widespread wildfires on record. Back in 2020, poor air quality from wildfires led to widespread colony losses in California. Beekeepers are concerned that severe wildfires in the future will cause more damage to their hives.
When you have wildfires, the smoke from the wildfires really brings down the air quality. That air quality also impacts honeybees, and honeybees are actually very...
In 2023, ARS released a report finding that poor air quality was a serious environmental stressor impacting honeybees. Specifically, the report concluded that air pollutants masked the floral odor receptors of honeybee antennae, which limited foraging success and colony nutrition. The report also found that poor air quality could be compounded by the presence of disease and correlated to lowered immune responses. Foraging is another area of concern for farmers and beekeepers. When bees forage, they not only pollinate our plants, they also collect food for themselves, the queen, the caretakers in the hive, and the brood, or babies. Seshadri has already observed that, long-term, bees will stay in areas where there's consistent, plentiful food. This is key for beekeepers and growers who are looking to keep pollinators on their farms long-term.
Bees are very good learners, they have very good memory. So once they find a good rewarding flower and they like it, they remember it and they come back to it.
Over the next 5 to 10 years, the long-term honeybee network aims to connect with all the apiaries and growing regions of California. This includes farmers, almond growers. California is the world leader in growing almonds, by the way. And of course, beekeepers, who provide critical pollinator services in almond orchards, sunflower fields, and other pollinator-dependent crop fields.
We need the almond growers and the fruit and vegetable growers to understand what the beekeepers are facing and work together to maintain both the systems, the food production system and the pollination system that the bees are providing.
Longer term, the research network could expand outside of California. Similar to how USDA has created climate hubs across the United States to help farmers and ranchers deal with changing climate, Seshadri envisioned a similar national network for bee data collection and guidance, given the importance of bees for U.S. agriculture and how climate change is affecting almost all regions of the U.S. This will enable bee labs from New York to California to share apiary metrics and use that data to enhance their research. This will also help them evaluate how environmental factors are impacting production of regional crops, nutrient availability for honeybees, and the effects of pesticides on bee reproduction and performance.
Honeybees are good model systems to understand what's going on with all pollinators. The big picture is this is a part of the ecosystem that's essential. The goal is that we're going to help sustain that ecosystem service that could otherwise get lost or could become so weak that we will not have a natural habitat and we will not have good enough fruits and vegetables for human diet. The long term here in California is going to give an indication of what is it that we need to focus on and hopefully work with these other labs to feed to the needs of California.
Stay tuned for our new episode next week, where we discuss the question that's on a lot of our minds. Can bees adapt to climate change? Bees have been around for millions of years, so they've seen a lot of environmental changes, and they've survived through adaptation, mainly migrating to places where food is available and weather conditions are better suited to shelter themselves, their hive, and their children. Today, bees and other pollinators are facing many pressing issues. either directly related to or amplified by climate change. And the big question is, can they adapt to our current climate change conditions?
At some level, yes, they can, and at other levels, no, they can't. Bees in general, in order to establish populations, need two things. They need a place to nest, and they need food to eat. Climate change can affect both of those elements that are just essential to establish populations. For example, fires are always on the front of our mind out here in the West. It obliterates nesting sites for pollinators, and those pollinators won't be able to establish in those areas until conditions become more supportive to them. When it comes to climate change effects on the food that they eat, well, there's a little, more play in the system there, in that plants that will, because of warmer temperatures, bloom earlier will match up with pollinators that can build populations earlier or emerge from wintering earlier. And so there'll be selection in favor of those particular phenotypes and genotypes. So it just depends on what kind of factors that we're talking about when referring to whether pollinators can adapt to climate change.
That's Dr. Gloria DeGrande Hoffman, research leader at the Carl Hayden Bee Research Center in Tucson, Arizona. DeGrande Hoffman noted that climate change has exacerbated the 4 Ps that are often linked to colony losses or decline: poor nutrition, pesticides, pathogens, and parasites.
We're never going to really solve the situation of colony losses without addressing climate change and starting to make management changes in how we look at commercial colonies and how we manage them, how we manage landscapes to support feral pollinator populations. Let's try to find these solutions in a climate that is changing, and with the realization that we're going to have to find these solutions under conditions of heat and drought and warmer winters and nutritional stress, and factor that into the solutions. And so that's what the grand challenge is about.
DeGrande Hoffman is leading a grand challenge here at ARS to create pollinator landscapes and overwintering practices to increase pollinator populations. The grand challenge addresses 3 primary issues. First, looking at how environmental change affects nutrients in plants and making that information publicly available.
Anybody who wants to know what plants should I put in my backyard, or should I plant in this open area that I have that are the best for supporting pollinators, will be able to go to the plants database and get that information. There'll be a pollinator section with both nutrient analysis, the time of bloom for pollinator plants, but also the bees that visit them.
The second goal of the Grand Challenge is to zoom out to a landscape level and determine where pollinator populations can be supported. The third goal is to develop recommendations for commercial and backyard beekeepers to manage their colonies in their changing environment. This includes overwintering, a key component of bee survival, but also an area that can be tough to manage.
Getting bees through the winter has become increasingly difficult, particularly in some of the temperate areas of the United States, where temperatures that are conducive for flight, and that's any temperature over 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can have quite a few bees flying. And when they fly, they age. You want the bees to be in the colony and flying very little by mid-October. And when you have those bees flying on into November, it corrupts the age structure of the colonies. You get too many old bees in there. And when spring comes around and they start flying again, the bees start dying at a rate that exceeds the emergence of new bees in the colony. And so the population declines, right?
Living in Maryland since the 80s, I've certainly seen changes in our weather, especially a much longer winter, but with sporadic days of warmth mixed in. During one of those 70 or even 80-degree days in the dead of winter, I'll see bees buzzing around my grass and trees, but they don't have anything to eat because nothing in my yard is flowering. It's interesting to learn that those extra days flying around during the winter can actually age the bee population.
The thing with honeybees is they're really tied together as a population. You need bees to make bees. And if bees that you have are declining, you can't make enough bees to sort of pull that population back up. And that's what we call a colony loss in the early spring.
According to DeGrande Hoffman, bees need to overwinter, which means staying in hibernation from late fall to early spring. This is a common practice for commercial beekeepers, but managing bees during the winter can be challenging. I mean, parents have a hard enough time keeping their kids from going outside during a warm winter day. Imagine trying to manage 60,000 bees. That's why DeGrande Hoffman and her team are developing guidance for beekeepers to help them overwinter their bees.
Honeybees are among just a few number of insects that are active all year long. And as colonies go into winter, they'll stop rearing brood and they'll start taking the nutrients that they get from fall pollens and store those nutrients in their fat bodies. And then when temperatures drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, those bees will start to cluster in the colony. And they shiver and they keep warm. They spend the duration of the winter as this tight nest of bees. When the colony is in a cluster like that, the bees aren't aging like they do when they forage. Forage creates a lot of stress on bees.
To avoid foraging during warm days in the winter, beekeepers are increasingly putting their colonies in cold storage.
So now we take these colonies, put them in cold storage where it's constant temperature of about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you just leave them in there. You pull them out when, for example, you're going to go pollinate almonds, or when the first pollens start to become available where you live, and you can pull them out. The colonies seem to do much better under those conditions.
The other issue being tackled by the Grand Challenge is bee migration due to climate change. ARS scientists are already seeing some pollinators move further north or to higher elevations to escape harsh conditions like drought, flooding, and wildfires.
For example, during the Ice Age and during other planetary events, they moved to places where they could, establish their populations. And that's happening now. Honeybees and other pollinators are moving, for example, into higher elevations or further north. And that causes local areas to have fewer pollinators in them because the conditions there aren't supportive.
While many pollinators will move to greener pastures, so to speak, DeGrande Hoffman noted that certain species of bees may choose to stay in a difficult environment, which greatly diminishes their chance of survival.
Pollinators that forage on specific flowers and have that tight relationship are clearly going to be the most susceptible to loss. There's no safety net for them if they lose nesting sites, or there's not enough forage for them to support themselves and also rear offspring. So yeah, it's difficult to adapt to catastrophic weather events. I mean, you have selection pressure on those colonies, and you have colonies that can adapt and survive. But if they only make up 30 to 40% of all the colonies that you have, and the other 70 die, I mean, that's what we're calling massive colony losses. Adaptation and selection are happening all the time. It's just that how it's played out and what the results are may not be something we want to see. For example, not having pollinators where you live anymore.
DeGrande Hoffman and her team are studying ways to keep bees in their native environments, which will greatly help growers pollinate their plants and keep their costs down.
The two areas that we're looking at in particular is how heat and drought can be affecting the nutrients that are available to bees in the pollen, and also how it affects flowering in plants. It's a basic question as to how do the growing conditions of plants ultimately affect the rewards that they're capable of presenting to pollinators.
Climate change is happening, and trying to fight it on the fly is a tremendous challenge. I asked DeGrande Hoffman what gives her optimism that we can meet this grand challenge and protect our pollinators.
One of the things that gives me great optimism is that, I asked a lot of folks once we started this grand challenge if they wanted to be part of it. And folks jumped at the chance to work in this interdisciplinary framework to solve this problem. I think we've got increasing awareness by so many different groups across the United States about the need for pollinators, but also about how we can reverse the effects of climate change. It was Margaret Mead who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." We're all going to be part of this solution. We all need to be. And we can change the world with it. We can reverse climate change. We can build our pollinator populations. But it's going to take all of us working together to be able to pull it off.
Be on the lookout for our new episode next week, where we find out what is stressing out bees. The answer may leave you itching and scratching.
Stephen Cook. I'm a research entomologist with the Bee Research Lab in Beltsville, Maryland, and we are there at the Bee Lab outside of Building 306. We have a pollinator garden, and we have 4 hives set up as demonstration hives that we will get people here to visit the lab, and we typically will take them and have some discussion about bees outside by the pollinator garden. I focus on combating varroa mites as well as honeybee physiology are the 2 main foci of my research program. Varroa mites is one of the major issues that bees are facing right now.
The varroa mite is one of the biggest threats to honeybees around the world. Essentially, it's a modern honeybee plague. Varroa is an invasive species that originated in Asia. In the 1950s, varroa actually shifted hosts from the Asian honeybee to the European honeybee, called Apis mellifera. This is the honeybee most prominent in the United States. Since then, it's caused millions of honeybee deaths and hugely impacted the agricultural industry.
Varroa mites can cause damage to bees both directly and indirectly. They can cause direct damage through their feeding on adult bees and also on developing bees, particularly pupae. They take some of the nutrients from the bees by feeding on them, and also cause indirect damage through the vectoring of harmful honeybee viruses, particularly deformed wing virus is one of the major ones that they vector. Feeding on bees causes some stress to the bee, obviously from being sucked on and having your tissues eaten and consumed by a parasite that's about the size, if it was you and I, where the varroa mite would be about the size of a large grapefruit. So imagine something that large sucking your blood, it would cause some stress.
Varroa mites have 2 distinct life stages. They have a dispersal stage where they latch onto adult bees and feed on their blood. This is also where they can transmit deadly pathogens. Then they have a reproductive stage, where they slide under the wax capping of the pupae, which is a developing baby bee, and the female mites lay their eggs.
If you allow the mites just to stay in their dispersal phase, they tend to become better at transmitting a virus that becomes an overt infection, which causes the symptoms that you can see on adult bees that have high levels of the virus. Those symptoms include a strange sort of abdomen shape, and the telltale sign is these deformed wings that are non-functional. We call these bees crawlers. They'll be crawling outside the entrance of the hives, being evicted probably by their nest mates, and they eventually will die.
Bees are very hygienic, and they try to eradicate the mites themselves, mainly by picking the mites off one another. The pupae emit a distinct smell when the mites are attacking their skin. That scent sends alarms to other bees in the hive who have a high sensitivity to the smell. Cook calls them the mite biters, and they literally snip the mites off the pupae or remove the infected pupae from the hive.
Get out of here!
The mites are tricky in that they can quickly change their smell. Colonies will have distinct cuticular hydrocarbon profiles, so they're able to recognize nestmates and foreign materials or foreign invaders. These mites quickly mask themselves with the smell of their host, and so it's hard to detect the mites. And they also have hairs on the backs of their body, on their dorsal side, the mites do, that are very much similar to the hairs of bees on the abdomen. So again, they're trying to mimic their host so that they can avoid detection. It's tricky to try to get rid of them without beekeeper intervention.
There's no cure for the varroa mite. Pesticides can help, but beekeepers have to be careful not to harm the honeybees. Cook and his team are studying other parasites, including a pathogenic fungus that could kill the mites without affecting the hive. This fungus has potential, but we still need to determine the correct dosage of fungus to apply, and there are other challenges as well.
Applying these fungal spores into a hive is tricky because bees are so hygienic and so clean. They do not like foreign objects in their hive. So they are very fastidious at cleaning themselves and grooming each other. These spores don't persist long in the hive. So that's been one of the hurdles that need to be overcome in order to hopefully get this product into a state where it can be used as a product for use by beekeepers. But there's a lot of steps ahead of that, of course.
Cook and his colleagues are looking at other strategies as well for reducing varroa populations in hives. He's noticed that beekeepers who overwinter their hives and provide proper nutrition seem to have fewer casualties due to pathogens.
There are beekeepers out there that do kind of what I have done and only breed or split those colonies that have overwintered successfully with exposure to mites, so that their stock colonies will become more and more resistant over time. So they are doing some backyard genetics to try to get their colonies more tolerant or resistant to mite infestations.
Beekeepers mainly use pesticides to control the varroa mite populations. But like I said earlier, they have to be careful not to spray too much or at a high dose and risk harming the hive. A lot of strategy goes into knowing when to spray, where to spray, and how much. And varroa mites are good at digging under the wing of the bee, which can actually protect them from the sprays. Like I said, these are tricky little suckers, literally.
That's right. If you can minimize the number of treatments, or if you can modify the treatment interval in such a way that it's effective against the mites but also gives bees time to recover from treatment exposure, then that would be benefit to the bees. There are some promising compounds that have been tested, and the problem with varroa mites and these previous chemical treatments is that varroa mites have gained resistance to them. These conventional pesticides that have active ingredients, mites have gained resistance to those, and so those were the conventional pesticides that beekeepers were using. There's really a push now to try to find alternative treatments, whether or not they're chemicals that are non-conventional. We call them biopesticides, oxalic acid, formic acid included. Those are options, but conventional pesticides, beekeepers are running out of options.
Cook is optimistic there will be a new suite of treatment options for beekeepers to use in the future. In the meantime, he recommends beekeepers closely monitoring their hives for varroa mites. You can see how in the video link posted below. If they see adult infestation rates approximately 3% or more, they should consider treating the entire hive. However, they should also mix in their treatment options for long-term effectiveness.
Monitoring the mite population is very important. You don't want to stick to just one treatment option because mites are becoming resistant to these chemical treatments, because you're going to get resistance quicker than if you had multiple treatment types used. That's one thing I would suggest, is to definitely mix up your treatments and don't rely on using the same one.
Some beekeepers have turned to brood breaks to try and reduce mite populations and spread of disease. This involves separating the queen hive for a certain period to keep her from laying eggs in the hive. By essentially skipping a generation, in theory, this method breaks the cycle of mite infection, as the mites have no place to lay their own eggs. Cook has seen success applying brood breaks, but he said the hive should still be treated with a pesticide.
You don't want to do like a brood break without a chemical treatment, because research has shown that when the mites are all just circulating on adult bees, the virus becomes much more virulent and increases in abundance. So you want to make sure that you're using a chemical treatment in conjunction with a cultural control.
Beekeepers certainly have their hands full trying to deal with varroa mites, among all the other risks to honeybees. Now you can add one more threat to the list. The laelaps mite originated from southern Asia and is slowly moving across the globe. Like the varroa mite, laelaps can feed on both young and adult bees and transmit deadly diseases. While it's not yet been spotted in the United States, its arrival may be inevitable.
There's a looming problem in the horizon, and it has already caused a whole lot of damage in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, and in China and other countries where Apis mellifera is managed. You can get both varroa mites and laelaps mites. That's the next big scare that we're having, is when do we anticipate this new mite species may come to the U.S.?
Cook is closely monitoring the spread of this new threat, and he's working with colleagues overseas to determine ways to mitigate or reduce the mite populations in different bee species, including Apis mellifera, or the western honeybee. You can keep up to date with his research by following us on Facebook and X. Okay, all this mite talk is making me itchy. Coming up next week, we'll take a look at the queen bee, the ruler of the hive. Is royalty all that it's cracked up to be? We'll find out. Being the queen bee may have its perks, but there's a lot of stress to the job. Sure, you have worker bees bringing you food, grooming you, and caring for your babies, but you're responsible for the livelihood of your children. Not just 3 or 4 babies, but tens of thousands. That could put tremendous stress on anyone, queen bees included.
Welcome to the Bee Lab. My name is Mohammed Al-Buraki and I'm a research scientist. Basically in my lab we are focusing on queen health and performance. The queen is a very important member of the colony. She is the mother of all the bees. Taking care of the health of the queen is very essential for the overall well-being of the colony and the performance of the colony, whether it's in terms of brood production, disease resistance, as well as production of honey and the rest of the product that we get from the hive.
Here at the Honeybee Lab in Beltsville, Maryland, Al-Buraki focuses on the health of the queen bee, the ruler of the hive, the mother of all the children, and the lone member of the throne. It's all about her, the queen, and keeping her healthy and stress-free is paramount.
If the queen is not doing well, then the whole population will degrade gradually and the performance of the whole colony will drop. And then we'll have mortality and we'll have other issue will come with in terms of disease for the whole population. So when we study queens, we studied queens in light of the whole population.
Of course, the queen's health isn't just vital to her hive, but to beekeepers as well. There's over 100,000 beekeepers in the U.S. Some are backyard beekeepers who have a few hives and serve their local communities. Commercial beekeepers have hundreds, some thousands of hives. That's millions of bees. Their role in agriculture is essential as they deliver bees to fields all over the country, and those bees pollinate many of the foods we eat, like almonds, apples, and blueberries. Beekeepers also play another essential role. They're on the front lines of colony reductions.
In the US, one of the problems that we've been hearing from beekeepers is poor performance on the queen that we are producing in the US. To address this issue, it's a complex process because queen go through a complex process to become the mother of the hive and established queen in a colony. In my lab, we study different aspects of the maternal lineages of those queen.
Much of this boils down to genetics. Does the queen have good genes? Or perhaps more important, does the queen have a diverse genetic background?
If they are genetically susceptible to disease and stuff, no matter what you do throughout the process, they will still have to express their genetic ability to resist disease, to be adapted to the environment, and so on and so forth. And then you have the abiotic stressor that will affect the whole community. So it's a mix. You can't study just one single aspect and find a cure for a big question. So you need to put the puzzles together. And that's what we do in the whole bee research lab.
Al-Buraki is studying the genetic history and diversity of queen bees here in the U.S. He sampled queens from across the country, captured different DNA markers, and then tested them for genetic diversity. What he found was a low diversity among the queen's genetic makeup. Basically, what's happening here is beekeepers are breeding queens from their existing hives. This produces new queens who have genes similar to their predecessors. Al-Buraki calls this mediocre diversity, and he sees it as a major concern.
By requeening every year, we are recycling an already mediocre diversity. When we talk about queen, we talk the diversity about the whole bees because the mitochondrial DNA is passed through from the queen to the drones, to the bees, to the workers. Because usually when you see a problem with all the queens across the big nation like the US, then the question is not like a punctual problem here and there or in an area or not. You probably have to address a question on the genetic background first.
Queen bees should have a diverse genetic background for many reasons. It enables them to better fight off pathogens. It keeps them stronger and healthier. It allows them to adapt to different climate conditions, and these diverse traits are then passed on to their children.
For example, the susceptibility to disease, even in human being, is related to our genetic baggage and background. Some people are lactose resistant or not. This is due to our genes and how much they are diversified, and that's a general notion. More you have traits and genes that can deal with many stressor, more your body can respond and shield you from the abiotic and biotic stressor of the environment. This is the exact same principle whether it's on bees or on human being or any living organism. Now, since those bees were domesticated, they are no longer at what we call the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, where the weak will die and the strong will survive. This is a complete different context. The natural selection doesn't apply here. So we need to be careful about our own selection and what we are selecting, and especially that all the honeybees, they are not native of the US. They've been imported. So the question is how much we've imported from their native lands.
Diversity is especially important today, where beekeepers often move their bees around the country. That forces the bees to not only pollinate different plants and flowers, but adapt to varying climates throughout the year. For this reason, beekeepers should breed a subset of queens with genes that match both their living and working environments.
Basically, it's a natural selection. They are very well adapted to, because this is their homeland. Oh, I grew up here, I know all the area. I'm a local guy, But now we're living in a time of globalization. We are moving bees and then bringing them to a new environment. They may adapt, but they're not going to adapt in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. They've been evolving millions of years, so the scale is very important here. What we can do is assign subspecies to climate zone, for example. In the US, we have 5 different climate zones. Some of them are dry, some of them are wet, some of them are cold. You can't bring an Italian bees from the Mediterranean and put that subspecies in, for example, Arizona, or in a harsh desertic environment. The probability of surviving or resisting the local stressors is much less than if we bring Syriaca, where their mainland is basically a desert area mainly. So this is a very critical point that is not applied here in the US currently.
What we'll learn in an upcoming episode is a growing trend for beekeepers to keep their bees in the same climate zones. Benefits include less travel, fewer temperature discrepancies, and familiar plants and flowers for foraging.
The major question is, do we treat them as a livestock, or do we do some program of preservation and local adaptation to the local climate? And that's a major question. It's not easy to answer this question or to even implement the proposal. But if we don't do that, we will continue having losses and then curing the symptoms, but not really the disease that we should address first.
Al-Baraki said he's hopeful that his research will encourage beekeepers and bee breeders to employ diversity in their craft. There are only 8 species of honeybees in the world, but there are approximately 32 subspecies, many of which have adapted well to certain climates. Breeding queens using diverse stock and subspecies will increase their diversity and help them face the myriad of challenges posed to them today.
We need to propose a sustainable strategy overall to better the life of the bees, and we need them for pollination, we need them for agriculture, we need them for beekeepers. And the overall goal is to solve the problems that we are facing and to propose strategies to better the life of the bees and their health.
In our new episode next week, we'll get advice on how you can make your yard friendlier for honeybees and other pollinators. In a future episode, we'll hear from bee experts Liz Walsh and Lainey Bilodeau from the ARS Honeybee Breeding, Genetics, and Physiology Research Lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They talk about breeding bees that can adjust to climate change, resist pests and diseases, and forage on a variety of plants. In today's episode, I asked them if they had tips for making our home yards more bee-friendly. Walsh spoke first.
The first thing would be to point out that during a lot of the year, the average citizen in the US's yard is a pollinator desert because you have all that green grass and nothing else. By incorporating a lot of blooming plants that have different times when they're blooming and producing nectar, you can turn that pollinator desert into more of a grocery store. And that's what is needed for not just honeybees, but also bats and hummingbirds and native bees and all sorts of other pollinators.
How do I know what types of bees are in my garden or my lawn?
I iNaturalist is a really, really neat place to catalog and utilize to identify a species of bees or other pollinators that you find in your area. There's also a bug guide online to help you ID what species of insect you have. These are really neat ways to take a sort of survey of your own backyard.
Hi, this is Lainey. iNaturalist is fantastic. That one in particular, because it is classic citizen science. You enter whatever you have, whatever you see, if it's something that you want to identify or just something that you want to record in your yard, you just go in, you take a picture, and it will give you suggestions. And then other people will come in and will confirm what you have. When you get 3 identifications, 3 positive confirmations on what you have, then it's considered research grade. And that is used for diversity studies and things like that. So you're helping the research community, you're helping pollinators, you're helping everything by doing this.
How could home gardeners and homeowners protect bees in their area from the 4Ps?
Pollinators are definitely beset by a lot of issues, including climate change, which we haven't turned into a P yet, but definitely contributes nonetheless to pollinator decline. Something that everyone can do is to help on that poor nutrition side of things by having a variety of floral resources that are appealing to pollinators, blooming throughout the foraging season. You, as just an average person, can help the pollinators, not just honeybees, but also butterflies and hummingbirds. You can find out very good plant species that are specific to your area by utilizing organizations like Pollinator Partnership or the Xerxes Society. Both have very, very good information and pamphlets on ecoregions and what plants are a good fit for those ecoregions.
I'll echo what Liz said, and that plant flowers and flowering trees also is another part of the landscape that will bloom as long as you can. That'll cover early spring into late fall or even winter. Like in the South, we have the camellias that bloom in the winter. So it's as wide of a berth as you can get and as diverse of a landscape as you can get. That really helps the pollinators. Try to do native plantings as much as you can because they are going to be locally adapted, and your plants are going to do well and your pollinators are going to also do well. There's lots of social media groups that are tied to native plants in your state, in your region, in your county. There's gardening groups. Get with your arboretums, go to your nature centers, go to your local nurseries because they're more likely to have local plants. And it's everything from letting the clover grow in your yard. Don't mow quite so often. There's blue-eyed grasses that go, and the bees will even go to those. There's all kinds of things that they can take advantage of.
Dandelions are possibly the most pivotal early spring flower in many northern climates in the US. It's that first chance that bees and other pollinators have to forage on food. So I always advocate for letting the dandelions stay. Let them go to seed. It's for the best, I promise.
Another question that's come up before is how far can bees travel to my garden? How far do they usually travel, or will they travel to a garden?
Yes, they will. Bees will prioritize good nutrition that is closer to their colony, but they'll go as far as they need to go. Typically, we think of that distance as about 2 miles away from the colony, but there have been reports of bees traveling much further, even up to 4 miles away from the colony in times where nutritional needs were not met by things that were closer to the colonies.
If I spray my garden, when's the best time to protect honeybees from the sprays? And what about grass too? If I spray my grass, should I be careful about any enhancements or weed killers?
Pesticides are one of the P's, and it's important to utilize them responsibly if you've determined that you need to utilize them at all. A way to decrease the effect that they might have on bees would be to time their use carefully. For instance, in a lot of agricultural settings, pesticide applicators will spray at night when the bees are not foraging to allow the plants time to take up the pesticide and to allow the bees the maximum amount of time for that pesticide to kind of break down or not be available when the bee next goes to that floral resource. If there's any way that you can avoid spraying plants that are blooming, that is definitely the best way to go.
Use products also that are going to be less toxic to bees. So use those safer soaps and things like that. Try to use the more organic type products. That'll be, if there is any error in application, then that will hopefully be less harmful to the pollinators.
There are non-pesticide based ways to control pests. For instance, if you have an aphid problem in your garden, you can order ladybugs online and you can release ladybugs in your garden. And the ladybug nymphs in particular avidly eat the aphids. And so that's a really neat, creative, and relatively cheap way to control your aphid population with no pesticides at all and with only a positive impact on the environment.
Are there certain times of the day that honeybees are most active and that maybe I should avoid my garden so I don't interfere with gathering their food?
I think that it's wonderful to try and not bug the bees, as it were, but really human presence does not bug the bees when they're foraging. They're pretty focused on doing their thing, and you can observe them and enjoy their presence without interfering with their food collection.
In arid areas, let's say more out west and in the southwest, is it helpful to provide a water supply, any kind of water supply, or will they get enough water from just pollinating the flowers?
A water supply is a helpful thing. If you notice that bees are going to something like a pool or to your bird bath or something like that, it really is an indication that there's a need that isn't being met just naturally. And so you can help easily by providing a shallow water source for bees. And shallow because bees will drown. If you have, for instance, a drip container for pots that you'd place under a pot so the water doesn't go everywhere. I used to fill them with stones and just fill it up with water. So the bees were able to land on the stones and drink the water. And as the water level went down, there were just more places for them to land. So providing a watering resource like that can be a good thing for both honeybees as well as other animals.
My final question was, what other tips do they have for getting bees to your garden and for keeping them in your garden?
A non-pesticide approach for several different things may include soapy water. For instance, if you have a fungal problem that's on the exterior of a plant, sometimes soapy water will work. If you want to attract pollinators, including native bees, really it's maximizing the bloom period of things that are in your yard. And you can also clump floral resources because if you just have one single plant, that only provides so much nectar. I would also like to add in addition to our discussion before about dandelions, that weeds are only weeds. Doing nothing to control the weeds is actually an incredibly positive action to take.
There are some weed species that actually can be quite beautiful. Goldenrod is a tremendous resource for pollinators. They have huge flower bunches at the top, and they are just covered with pollinators if you actually let it go to bloom. Then there's some propagated plants that are non-native, things like celosia, that pollinators absolutely love. They're locally adapted. They're not going to spread like wildfire through everybody's yard and take over because we don't want invasive species either. There are some really good plants like that are really great pollinator plants that are safe, that are not native. So there's lots of opportunity, but like Liz said, do them in bunches and cover that bloom period and do flowering trees as well.
In next week's episode, we look at how some pesticides may be affecting the behaviors of honeybees. Talk to you then.
This is an example of how we might process a honeybee sample taken from one of our colonies. We would start by dissecting out various tissues, and we do this sometimes to look at the morphology of these tissues. We compare those that have been exposed to different experimental treatments, or we might also look at the expression of important genes in these tissues. Here, Eliza is dissecting out a honeybee gut.
We're back in the lab at the Invasive Species and Pollinator Health Unit in Davis, California. We're watching ARS research technician Eliza Litzy examine the inside of a honeybee. And the voice you're hearing is Dr. Julie Fine, a research entomologist here at the lab.
Sometimes there are various pesticide treatments, for example, that might result in what's called precocious foraging, which is when a bee is young, but for whatever reason they begin to behave like a forager. And oftentimes these precociously foraging bees aren't as good as natural foragers that aged into it the normal way, because the rest of their physiology doesn't quite match up.
Fine's work here at the lab focuses on how exposure to different pesticides affect honeybee behaviors. Before she studied bees, Fine worked at a plastics chemical company. She also had an interest in insects, especially bees, so she pursued a PhD in entomology at Penn State. With these experiences, she was uniquely suited to study bee exposure to pesticides.
Honeybee behaviors are important because they're social insects. You have a lot of insects all working together toward one common goal. And you can imagine this requires a lot of coordinated behaviors. And if any of these behaviors are changed, or if they can't do what they need to do, then you're going to see a problem with the larger colony organism as a whole.
Fine is studying the linkages between different chemicals used to combat different pests and how honeybees interact with those chemicals. She's especially interested in how these interactions affect their reproductive systems, which could result in potential brood loss or colony loss. She found that one pesticide class, known as insect growth disruptors, targets immature pests and disrupts their growth or reproductive systems. This can also negatively impact bees in surprising ways.
And the problem is that a lot of these are hormone mimics, and they mimic hormones that honeybees also have. So you can see that under certain circumstances, these will affect different behaviors of insects, including some reproductive behaviors. For honeybees, this means that they can affect the queen and her egg laying, or they may affect the behavior of the worker bees towards the queen.
During Fine's research, she's seen how these pesticides affect the development of honeybees, ultimately resulting in workers that are less attracted to the queen's pheromone. She did note that her research involved pesticides at very high doses, likely higher than what bees typically encounter while pollinating. So these levels should be considered a worst-case scenario, and these findings still need to be verified in the field.
Downstream, what this could mean if bees were exposed to these levels is that we might see adult bees that are less prone to caring for the queen in the colony, making her less able to produce eggs, and then we would see a decline in the colony population.
Fine noted that certain pesticides are known to accelerate the behavioral development of bees, a behavior she calls precocious foraging.
What happens when bees are exposed to stressors is sometimes they can cause nurse bees or young bees to begin foraging too young. And this might sound like a good thing because you have more of a foraging workforce to bring back resources to the colony, but in reality, they're not usually good foragers. They're not ready, not developed enough yet to go out and encounter some of the different scenarios that they encounter outside the colony.
Throughout a bee's life, they have different tasks. Older bees typically go out and forage, bringing back food for the queen and the hive residents. Younger honeybees typically stay in the hive to care for the queen. When younger bees go out and forage, there may not be enough younger bees to nurse the brood and tend to the queen. This can result in the queen being less able to produce eggs because she relies on workers to constantly care for her.
So you have poor foragers leaving and fewer bees inside the colony to care for the queen and the developing larvae.
This phenomenon can lead to a slow, gradual decline in the colony population, and it can also lead to poor health of the queen. It's not something a beekeeper would notice day to day, and that's a big issue in itself. Oftentimes, when a beekeeper starts to notice a decline in bees, it's already too late. There's no way to repopulate the hive. This is why Fine shares her research with beekeepers and farmers, and she tries to identify red flag scenarios for beekeepers to be aware of so they can intervene before it becomes a bigger issue.
I want growers to know what they're applying to their crops, what it actually does. Because I think too often people think of pesticides causing mass bee die-offs, and the only time you have a problem is when you see a pile of dead bees. But in reality, what beekeepers experience oftentimes is they remove their colonies from certain situations and they don't immediately see a problem. The problem emerges later, possibly with the next brood cycle, or as you begin to see more problems from bees not performing the behaviors they're supposed to be doing inside the colony. It can look like a slow dwindling, and it can be really difficult then to go back and identify the source of the problem.
Fine has forged a strong relationship with local beekeepers and farmers, and she points out that communication with her stakeholders runs both ways.
I tend to listen to them because you have beekeepers here with a lot of experience that know a lot more than me about the reality of situations. There's a lot I can learn from them. I want to know what problems they're encountering so I can make my research address realistic questions.
Don't miss our new episode next week, where we look at the role other bees play in our pollinating ecosystem. Honeybees are the most common pollinators in the United States. But did you know the most common honeybee isn't actually native to the U.S.? The western honeybee is the most popular honeybee in this country, and it was founded in Europe and Western Asia.
And it was brought into the North America first by Spaniards, not for the honey, but for the wax to make candles, which is kind of interesting. And then the colonists brought honeybees with them. So we as humans have taken the western honeybee with us and spread it worldwide because we're managing to use it for pollination, but we also get the benefit of getting honey out of it. For those who haven't tasted a lot of different types of honey made from different parts of the country or coming from different types of flowers, it's almost like tasting wine, that you have a huge variety of different flavors and tastes that you can get from the honeys.
That's Dr. Diana Cox Foster, research leader at the Pollinating Insect Biology Management Systematics Research Unit in Logan, Utah. Cox Foster studies bees and pollinators of all kinds. And believe me, there's more types of bees than you think.
There's over 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And here in North America, we have over 4,000 species. And the reason I say over is because we think there's a lot of bees out there that we have not yet identified as species. So there's a lot more to be discovered. The majority of those bees are pollinating plants, flowering plants, and are very important to both natural ecosystems and also to agriculture.
Cox Foster is studying not only how bees forage within their own species, but also how they work in tandem with other species, and how that benefits growers. In the Northeast, for example, honeybees and native bees work together to pollinate apples and other plants.
The more different kinds of bees you have, the greater your fruit yield is, and the larger the apples will be, the grade out higher. So the growers actually benefits by attracting all the bee species that they can.
We hear so much about honeybees, which are social insects, meaning they work in groups. There are also stingless bees, such as carpenter bees, and bumblebees, whose colonies actually live a year. But the majority of native bees in the United States are actually solitary, meaning they work alone.
You have to think of solitary bees, like each female bee is like a single mom. She goes out and she gathers pollen and nectar and creates her own nests, lays an egg, seals it off, and goes on to make new nests. And then she actually never encounters her offspring. I'd say 90% of the bees that we have in North America are solitary bees.
Here at the Bee Lab in Logan, they house the National Pollinating Insect Collection with over 2.3 million different specimens.
This is very valuable. Part of our research is figuring out who the bees are and where they're found, and that's what we can use the collection for. It's a historical record, because we know that a lot of the bee species have been having a lot of stress in the populations are declining or in danger of various things. We can go back to bees that were collected 80, 100 years ago and still get DNA from those bees, and we can learn a lot from those genetic sequences about different traits that bee has.
Cox Foster also uses the collection to study how bees interact with different plants. For example, she's studying how bees can help seed production in alfalfa. Alfalfa is one of the most widely grown crops in the United States. Growers of alfalfa depend heavily on solitary bees to help propagate their crops, including the alkali bee.
This is an incredibly beautiful bee. It has these brilliant iridescent blue, green, yellow stripes on the abdomen. It digs its nest down in the ground, and that's where it brings the pollen and nectar and lays its eggs. And the growers of these alfalfa who make use of this bee actually create specialized bee beds. Some of the growers have told me that they value their bee beds more than they value their homes. But they can also make use of the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, which is a solitary bee. Somehow it got introduced from Europe into North America in the 1940s, and it spread across many, many different states, but now it's one of the bees that we can make use of for alfalfa seed production, as well as canola and also blueberries. And we're also asking, can it be used for other crops, like even pollinating raspberries inside hoop houses or controlled environment agriculture?
Integrated pest and pollinator management is another focus of her work. How to balance the needs of the grower while protecting pollinators from pesticides.
How can we choose the pesticides that are less harmful to the bees, or how to apply those pesticides when they won't affect the bees? We do a lot of work on sensitivity of bees to pesticides, also working to help provide EPA with essential data and to agrochemical companies who are concerned about protecting bees on how some of these other bees are exposed to pesticides. What's the risk to those bees?
Another interesting aspect of Cox Foster's research is bee compatibility, how different bee species can work together, and how growers can take advantage of that working relationship. They're seeing this in Northern California, where honeybees and blue orchard bees, also called mason bees, pollinate almond orchards together. The results are greater yields for almond producers. California is the biggest producer of almonds in the world, by the way.
We don't understand why they work so well together that you get this greater pollination, and that's one of the questions we want to ask. But there are other farmers too, even like soybean farmers, that now know certain varieties of soybeans are highly attractive to honeybees and to the other bees, and that adds a significant amount of pollination yield on top of their crop. Like even in California this year with all the rain that came in. So the blue orchard bees were out actively doing pollination, whereas honeybees don't like rain. They don't like cold temperatures, so they stay in the hive. The two of them together, it's sort of like you're guaranteeing pollination. And I think we've developed means now that the single bee manager, like a beekeeper, could make use of both species and help with the pollination there. The greater you're encouraging diversity of your bees and getting them to live in your area, the better off you are too.
Cox Foster works closely with mason bees because they're so important to growers in the West. Not only are they native to the region, but they're an early spring bee, which is especially valuable to almond and apple growers whose crops bloom in February and March. The key is to provide a good home to these valuable bees, so they stay and propagate year-round. Cox Foster and her team are showing growers how to make these tiny nest boxes to entice the mason bees to live where they work.
We call them fiesta boxes, sort of like a little mailbox, and then a bundle of straws that are in their particular diameter. And then they need mud also. We work with growers sometimes to get a source of water to create a mud patch out in the field. They fly back and forth and they create a little mud depression or soil depression, collect the pollen and the nectar and bring it in, lay an egg, and then keep building out. And if they fill up one straw, each female claims their own straw and leaves a little mark on it so they know whose is whose.
Speaking of homes, despite our vast research into bumblebees, there's still so much we don't know about what happens inside their colonies. As Cox Foster noted, bumblebee colonies are often small and typically have a small workforce.
We wanted to figure out when they were foraging and how many were foraging, what times a day. We're looking at interactions of species. And we were asking an important question about how a honeybee apiary impacts other bees that are out there.
In order to collect this information, Cox Foster and her team partnered with a company to develop smart bombus units, which are gates placed inside the colonies that monitor the movement of the bees.
And it is a system where we have gates the bees go in and out of, and monitors records when they go in and out. It gives us this information, but we're getting a lot more too from it, like what's the temperature inside the colony, what's the temperature outside. So we're actually learning a lot about bumblebees that we didn't know about before.
It seems like the more researchers learn about bees, the more questions they have. I asked her if that was a good thing.
I think that's a good mark of any kind of science, that you answer one question and all of a sudden you got 5 or 10 more questions to follow up on. It's choosing the ones that are going to get us to the next step in agriculture production. Part of our mission is ensuring pollination in the natural ecosystems too, in the wild. And I think that's part of the reason being a scientist. You keep learning new things and all of a sudden you realize how little you know that there's many more things to discover.
You'll want to tune in next week when we go on the hunt for a vicious predator that can wipe out an entire hive in minutes.
We are now inside the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And this is a display I helped Smithsonian Education Department and exhibits work on, highlighting the work done by ARS and APHIS and the Washington State Department of Agriculture on the detection and hopefully eradication of the non-native northern giant hornet, Vespa mandarinia. This is a major pest of honeybee. Any social insect becomes a prey item for this giant hornet. We're concerned, obviously, in the United States because these hornets attack our bees, reduce our honey production, reduce our ability to pollinate crops. And it's important to always be recognizing when a non-native is here and what kind of impact they might have on the environment.
Back in late 2019, a rather large, bright orange and black hornet was sighted for the first time in the Pacific Northwest. Compared to a typical honeybee found in the United States, this hornet is huge, roughly 2 inches in length. Its head alone is almost as large as a honeybee. Officials who found the first specimens called ARS research entomologist Matt Buffington to help identify something they haven't seen before in the United States.
I'm told on the phone, be aware that this specimen's on its way, and that's pretty rare when they call you. So I'm like, okay, this is important. All research is important, but it seems like this might be even more important.
Buffington gets calls all the time to identify insects. That's one of his primary jobs. You see, the United States receives thousands of shipments every day from all over the world, including clothes, cars, materials, and food. It's easy for insects from other countries to hitch a ride on a shipment container and make its way here, where it could become an invasive insect. USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, they check shipment containers for these hitchhikers. And when they find something they can't identify, they call Buffington. This is critical because non-native insects can wreak havoc on our crops. Just look at the brown marmorated stink bug or the spotted lanternfly. In this case, Buffington received a call about a possible predator to the honeybee.
So I get the specimen, I pin it, I put a label on it, and then I go get the collection and bring the drawer into my office to compare my unknown Vespa with the determined Vespas. And sure enough, it matches up species-wise with Vespa mandarinia. But this is where the power of collections come in. I started looking at the specimens we have, which is a few hundred. Not a single one was from North America. They were all from Asia. And it's very unlikely that a species whose adults are as big as Vespa mandarinia would have escaped detection in North America. So right off the bat, I now understood why people were calling and making sure I got the specimen, because it was very clear This thing had not been recorded in the United States before.
Buffington identified the specimen as Vespa mandarina, the common name being Asian giant hornet. It was later renamed the northern giant hornet. And this hornet wasn't just an enemy of our most common honeybees. It could literally massacre entire honeybee colonies.
The hornet is a social insect predator. Its goal is to exploit the larval bodies inside the bee hive. It's not actually interested in adult bees. It's interested in adult bees from the standpoint that it must exterminate them all in order to remove whatever larvae they want. First, a scout locates a suitable nest to attack. She marks that nest and flies back to her own nest and recruits her sisters to come with her on this raid, if you will. When they arrive, they elicit an alarm from the bees. The bees now detect that there is an invader. The bees elicit their response, which is a mass emergence to attack a would-be predator. This is exactly what the hornets want, because the hornets are waiting for them, and as they emerge from their nest, they fly up underneath them, grab them with their legs, often do kind of a really neat acrobatic barrel roll and decapitate them all at the same time in one move. And 10 to 12 hornets can eliminate the entire contents of the adults of a bee nest, leaving corpses all over, literally all over the place. So you can imagine if you're a beekeeper, it's probably one of the more terrifying things to see. And then they go in and take all the larvae. They fly back, they macerate the larvae, which means grind it up, and then they feed it to their own larvae.
If the northern giant hornet were ever to establish here in the United States, it could wipe out billions of honeybees who are critical to our agro-ecosystem. Soon after the first specimen was found, local officials received multiple reports of sightings of this large hornet. Federal and state agencies scoured the Pacific Northwest and spotted the hornets, but they couldn't find the nests. Former ARS researcher Jacqueline Serrano worked with the Washington State Department of Agriculture to locate a hive of hornets. They actually did this by capturing a single hornet, subduing it, tagging it with an antenna, and then tracking its path. The hornet led the team straight to its nest, which interestingly wasn't on a tree branch, but rather inside a tree trunk. One hive, and some of its residents, were sent here to the Smithsonian for further investigation by Buffington and his staff. A large display was also set up inside the Smithsonian, so the general public could see where they live, how large they are, and how they destroy honeybees. Honeybees here in the U.S. can't protect themselves or their hives from the northern giant hornet, but Buffington pointed out that native bees in Asia, they know how to defend their hives.
Apis cerana is the Asian honeybee, and Apis cerana co-evolved with Vespa mandarinia. Apis cerana has a defensive technique that can actually detect when the hornet is in their nest, and they immediately elicits a response that the bees must eliminate this scout before the scout has a chance to go back and bring help to start the battle. So what Apis cerana workers do inside the nest is they begin to pile on top of the hornet, kind of like a dog pile, but a bee pile. And they start beating their wings very fast. They use these wing beatings to generate massive amounts of muscle activity in their thorax. This actually puts off heat, and they literally cook the hornet alive. Once the hornet is dead, they eject it from the nest, and it never has a chance to report back to its nestmates.
It's interesting that they must have learned this over generations, this defense mechanism that we haven't learned yet.
Right, and it's not a learned behavior. We have to be careful taking more human concepts and applying them to nature. This is a classic case of natural selection. Whatever species came before Apis cerana that did not have the ability to defend itself, they're no longer with us. The ones that were able to detect it and were able to defend themselves, they're the ones who survived. In the case of Apis mellifera, it never had this challenge. It's never faced it before, so it could go extinct in North America if Ves mirandarenia was allowed to run rampant.
Buffington has access to over 1,000 different species of bees and hornets in this massive insect collection here inside the Smithsonian, including Apis mellifera, a descendant of Europe, which is now the most common honeybee in the United States. The Smithsonian keeps them in airtight drawers, which are themselves in steel cabinets, all of which is in a temperature-controlled space. How do you keep the bodies from deteriorating?
So insects are unique in that they're chitinous, which is an extremely stable carbon chain. If you keep them dry, dry is very critical, and cool, and in the dark. There's no telling how long they'll last. They just don't decompose. The internals will. In certain kind of fatty insects, like really big moths, they have to be treated very carefully because they will like exude oil over time. But the hard things like beetles, hornets, they basically don't decompose. Just you keep them pest-free and moisture-free. That's one of the critical things about this collection is it's a long-standing, established collection that has the infrastructure to take care of something like this. It's no accident. It looks amazing.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work went into that. And that's the beautiful relationship between ARS and the Smithsonian is they help provide the infrastructure ARS needs to keep a collection like this, and we help Smithsonian by curating it. It's a wonderful symbiotic relationship.
Back to the northern giant hornet. Buffington keeps close tabs on the search for new nests, and fortunately, none have been discovered since 2021. However, researchers continue to scour the Pacific Northwest for new sightings, because just one nest can cause massive destruction and lead to bigger problems across the U.S.
You can't turn your back on these things, because if one nest survived, if there were 96 queens in here, any one nest can have that many queens, and each one of those can start their own colony. So you can do the numbers, and it's pretty scary.
Tune in for our new episode next week, where we dive into the microbiome of a bee and see if good health really starts in the gut. Our next trip takes us to Madison, Wisconsin, a major cranberry producing region in the country. We caught up with Dr. Sean Steffen, a research entomologist at ARS's Vegetable Crops Research Unit here in Madison. One of the things Steffen is studying is the tight, not tart, relationship between bees and cranberries.
In Wisconsin and other growing regions, there are these hordes of native bees that have evolved with cranberries. Cranberries are a native plant in the US and North America, and there are lots of pollinators that like to visit the flowers and pollinate. Cranberry growers can also buy bumblebee colonies and have them pollinate, but the rental of honeybees for a grower is one of their biggest annual expenses. So pollination is a big deal for US cranberries.
Steffen is looking into ways that cranberry growers can keep native bees on their lands, which saves them money and provides suitable on-farm habitat for their pollinators.
If you, as a grower, are so lucky to have good numbers and good diversity of native bees, and they're coming on your land to pollinate your crop for free, maybe there's some things you can do to not interfere and even to encourage them. That's what much of my work is on, like ways to provide local housing for these native bees. Because for cranberries in Wisconsin and also like East Coast, there are lots of native bees, especially bumblebees, that are really good cranberry pollinators. So let's figure out how to not get in their way.
Steffen's primary research is on the importance of microbes, tiny microorganisms that help preserve food and provide nutrients for baby bees. Microbes are essential to a young bee's growth. I'll let Steffen explain.
There's a mass, a mix of pollen and nectar and other things that go into a big ball, and it's what the baby bee eats. It's got one big lunchbox for its entire life, and that lunchbox takes about 2 to 3 weeks to consume. There's no refrigeration, there's no preservation to keep microbes from just devouring that pollen mass and potentially turning it into black liquid. So what these bees rely on are microbes that are the right kind. It's sort of like the microbes that are in sourdough starter. You've got acid-forming bacteria and then yeast that is really good at breaking down complex sugars. So these are kind of like wood-eating yeasts that can persist and digest that pollen mass along with the bacteria. And the two of them together form this partnership. And what we've shown is that they really do eat the pollen. Microbes, in the truest sense, consume the pollen mass, digest it, consolidate the proteins and sugars and lipids, consolidate that into microbial biomass, and then the bees, when they eat the pollen provision, they eat lots of microbial protein, microbial lipids, and sugars, and it's really good food for bees. How do we know that? Because when we take away the microbes, the bee larvae starve, or you get a really small and sickly pupa and not a very healthy adult.
It's interesting to learn that bees, like humans, have lots of microbes inside their bodies, and they rely on those microbes to stay healthy. Apparently, bees also benefit from microbes living on the outside of their bodies, what he calls exosymbionts. These microbes do the front-end work of digesting that pollen provision.
A lot of them are acid-forming bacteria. And that is really important because when you acidify the pollen mass, it keeps bad microbes from taking off. Two things happen over time in that external, that fermenting pollen mass. It desiccates, which is like loses water. It loses simple sugars. And at the same time, it's being acidified. And all of that together tends to render that pollen mass not invasible. Invasible just means opportunistic, undesirable microbes can't invade. They transform the pollen mass into something that is not easily invaded by pathogens. They're just good at defending their turf. And so that's another important function that these external microbes serve for bees.
There are so many similarities between the microbiome of bees and humans. As humans, we need a diverse community of microbes in our bodies to keep us healthy, especially fending off viruses and diseases. Bees also need a diverse community of microbes to fight against pathogens that can not only harm them and their young, but can wipe out entire colonies.
It's like a turf war. It's like a street fight. Every square millimeter. If you have abundant and diverse microbes present in the bee food, on the bee body, then what it tends to do is hold in check pathogens. And that's one of the messages that I'm trying to get out to other researchers, that when you're looking at bee immunity, when you're looking at curious behaviors, when you're looking at disease incidents in bees or in plants, please measure to some degree microbes. Because if you're trying to attribute cause and effect to some factor that doesn't involve or isn't mediated by microbes in some way, then you're probably missing a big part of the story, because the microbes are truly everywhere, and they've been everywhere for millennia.
Bees, plants, and microbes form what Stefan describes as a three-way symbiosis. Each player performs a service for the other, and if you take away one player, such as the microbes, that can cause problems for both the plant and the bees.
You need all three of these communities to get the job done, which is to say, make bees, plant reproduction, and persistence of the crops that we want, and the bees that we need to pollinate them. You need microbes to facilitate the persistence and success of both.
Stefan is studying microbes in native bees, bumblebees, and to an extent honeybees. And he's asking the question, what can we do to help further their development and not disrupt it? One answer is to limit the use of certain fungicides while bees are pollinating.
Some fungicides appear to be totally fine for bees, but some do not. And one particular compound, chlorothalonil, residues of that were really harmful for bumblebees. Not the adult, but the larva. Things that can be done are try not to spray the fungicide on the flowers when they're blooming. There's a lot of work showing that a fungicide application before bloom, then maybe one during bloom, and then one post. Instead of doing 3 apps during bloom, you can kind of have one during bloom and then the other 2 like bookends sandwiching bloom. And so you get disease suppression without putting as much fungicide residue on the pollen.
Stefan also recommends providing what he calls local housing for the bees. That could be as simple as putting out nesting sites for bees on a farm or in a backyard.
A lot of bees, they want to just have a gallery or some kind of tunnel in which to provision their young. So just give it to them. And then that becomes the hub from which they can do their foraging. And if you put that hub right in the middle of your farm, then the vast majority of their foraging is going to be at the flowers on your farm where you want the bees to forage.
Getting back to microbes, Stefan hopes that bee researchers consider the role of microbes when assessing or evaluating the health of bees. It's often a factor that isn't considered when studying bee health.
In a world where we're dealing with issues like colony collapse in honeybees, not only are we losing 30+% of our honeybees over the winter, like there's winter kill, and we're also losing really heavy percentages of honeybees midsummer. In assessing what is good for a bee or good for the pollination of your crop, ask which microbes are there and what are they doing. Consider the identity of the microbes and the abundance so that you can at least inform your question and also refine your answer, because it's very often that you have curious results or inconclusive results that kind of spawn more questions, and that's always the case. But so often the roles and importance of microbes in this symbiosis are not even considered at the outset. So I would just hope that the researchers would at least have microbes on their radar when they're trying to do the problem solving.
In our final bee episode next week, we're going to talk with bee breeders and learn about their quest to build the perfect bee. How do you build a perfect bee? One that is productive, durable, can resist viruses and diseases, and can adapt to a changing climate. Well, I'd say Mother Nature's done a pretty good job creating bees with many of these traits. But evolution can take time, and today's bees are facing so many challenges. Both old ones like diseases and predators, and new ones like pesticides and different foraging patterns. Humans have been breeding honeybees for centuries to help them adapt to new environments. And with technology improving at a rapid pace, breeders may now have the tools to build a perfect bee.
In a sense, breeding has happened on varying scales for hundreds of years, for sure since the 1800s, especially in parts of Europe. And one of the challenges that they faced was that they didn't have the capabilities or capacity to do artificial inseminations like we do.
That's Dr. Liz Walsh, a research scientist at ARS's Honeybee Breeding, Genetics, and Physiology Research Lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Walsh works closely at the lab with ARS research leader Lainey Bilodeau, using artificial insemination to breed honeybees that can adapt to the environmental challenges of today.
You think of artificial insemination as cows or horses or things like that, but we actually can do this on honeybees as well. And it takes very tiny instruments, but we breed bees that have traits that we want to propagate, that we want to carry on to the next generation to try to improve these traits.
One of the biggest accomplishments at the breeding lab here has been breeding bees for resistance to the highly destructive varroa mite. As mentioned earlier in the podcast, the varroa mite can spread deadly viruses between honeybees, causing entire colonies to die.
We have a long-standing breeding program for varroa-sensitive hygiene, and it does give the bees really good varroa resistance. So we will pick those queens that have colonies with the very strong expression of that trait, and drones as well from different colonies, and then we will breed them with artificial insemination.
Bilodeau and her colleagues not only breed for specific traits, such as varroa-sensitive hygiene, or VSH, but also for general characteristics that make them healthy, robust, and productive. For example, they successfully bred Russian honeybees brought over from the Primorsky region near Siberia. These honeybees score well for not only Varroa resistance, but production as well.
One advantage that they have against the Varroa mite is that they were right next to the original species that Varroa parasitized. And so evolutionarily, they were right there, right next to it. So they came with these mechanisms to deal with the Varroa mites.
Breeding may be quicker than evolution, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Researchers face many challenges when trying to breed for either specific or general traits.
Some of the challenges are that you can breed for a trait and you can get too much of a good thing. In the course of the VSH breeding program, when you bred solely for VSH and you didn't outcross any of the bees, the genetics got a little squirrely and the bees just cleared everything out of the colony. That can be a problem. You can breed too far. We have to make sure that we have the genetics diverse enough that we don't have those problems. Another thing is that we want to avoid inbreeding. That's a very big issue because in honeybees, particularly if we have inbreeding, then the brood dies because we get diploid drones and they are not sustainable for the colony. So they end up dying.
Despite these challenges, researchers here have a record of success breeding honeybees with traits that enable them to adapt to a diverse ecosystem.
We're working on nutrient assimilation so that the bees can more effectively use the nutrients in the food that they're eating. We're looking at general resilience, and we're looking at other resistance traits, disease resistance traits, and traits related to queen health.
They're also continuing to work to combat the Varroa mite, which remains one of the biggest threats to honeybee survival.
We're trying to get at what's driving it so we can look at the genetics of that and then use genetic markers to help us speed up those breeding efforts. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty of it now because we have some very highly skilled scientists and the technology has gotten to a point where we can take advantage of that for breeding that next better bee.
Climate change is on the minds of all ARS researchers, and bee breeders here are no different. In the case of honeybees, climate change is altering blooming seasons. For example, a warm winter may cause flowers to bloom while the honeybees are winterizing. This causes the bees to come out during their resting phase to look for food, but there's no food available.
That's a big problem that's affecting the entire beekeeping industry and even native bee populations, all the bees. Flowers are blooming earlier, or in some cases they're blooming later, but it's not timed right because the bees need to build up energy to go into winter. And they need certain things from those plants to go into winter. They need things that they can build up good energy storage. And then in the spring, they need certain flowers blooming when they come out, when things thaw. We want to work on these bees and help them have better ability to overwinter so that they can have these energy stores.
ARS researchers are working on alternative nutrition sources that beekeepers can feed their colonies during the winter. One food source is microalgae, which could provide nutrients to help bees boost their immune system to fight off viruses.
One of the real benefits of using microalgae is that it's sustainable and it is scalable. It can potentially be grown in huge vats and it would be fairly easy to produce.
This is Liz. I think beekeepers need to know what's going on in their colonies and be aware and familiar with the environment. Bees need a certain specific number of amino acids and proteins that are found in pollen, and they also need a robust amount of carbohydrates, which are found in nectar, to continue to be healthy and to survive. Hopefully, those needs are met in the environment, but if they're not, the beekeeper has to both be aware that the bee's nutritional needs are not being met and be ready to intervene with additional food.
I can't really blame bees for going out looking for food when they're hungry. I mean, we all get a little hangry at times, and bees are no different. Or are they? Actually, Walsh is looking into that.
I have the pleasure of being in the second year of a really exciting study that I call the Hangry Bee experiment. What we're doing is we're simulating pollen dearths at a single apiary location, and we're seeing how it affects the bees on both a behavioral and a molecular level.
Basically, what they're doing is allowing bees to venture into an apiary where food is available. And for half the bees, they can bring the food back to their colony. But for the other half, Walsh installed traps that rob the bees of their pollen as they exit the apiary.
And we found that pollen dearths do affect honeybee temperament. So in particular, aggressive responses are higher in bees that are hangry, if you will, that have been pollen deprived. And the molecular mechanisms behind that we're still exploring.
The bees that were hangry showed aggressive behaviors, including stinging, pursuing a potential predator, in this case Walsh, and clinging tightly to one another, another form of agitation.
We also see colony level effects that include decreased brood production and lower population levels.
These observations can be shared with beekeepers to recognize signs that their bees may not be getting enough food or nutrition. The study may also help researchers breed bees that can more efficiently collect and store food, another step towards building the perfect bee. Speaking of which, I asked Bilodeau how she envisions building the perfect bee.
I envision that we can layer traits on top of each other. So not just have a bee that is just furrow resistant or just virus resistant or just really uses its nutrients, but that we can layer these things on top of each other. And that's tricky. But right now we're just developing those lines and then we're going to see how they play together. I think that best bee of the future is going to be able to resist viruses and resist pesticides because that's definitely an issue. We need these bees to be able to be tough and they need to be able to survive all of the onslaught that they have and to be able to be flexible with the effects of climate change. So that resiliency, I think, is kind of the key, right? So it's got to come back to just building a stronger bee.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast on honeybees and other pollinators. They're so important to our ecosystem and our livelihood. To find out how you could help honeybees, visit your local extension service or go to our Science in Your Shopping Cart website to find your local extension. For Science in Your Shopping Cart, I'm Todd Silver. Thanks for listening.
Science in Your Shopping Cart is produced by the Office of Communications, Agricultural Research Service, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. For more information, visit www.ars.usda.gov. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, like us on Facebook, and watch us on YouTube.